November 30th, 1943. Tehran, Iran. Soviet Embassy basement. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov's hand paused mid-signature on the operational report, his pen hovering over words that would never appear in any official Soviet document. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Through the embassy window, he could hear the distant sound of American-built Studebaker engines rumbling through Tehran's streets, carrying Soviet supplies for the conference where Stalin would meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that moment, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander confronted a truth that would remain buried in classified archives for nearly 50 years. The Red Army that was pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin was rolling on American trucks, burning American fuel, eating American food. Without this aid, as Stalin himself would admit in a private toast just hours later, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps would cross the treacherous Arctic convoys, the Persian Corridor, and the Pacific route into Soviet hands. More vehicles than the Soviet Union produced during the entire war. More trucks than most nations possessed in total. These machines would transform the Red Army from a force that moved at the speed of marching men and horses into a mechanized avalanche that could sustain operations across 1,000-mile fronts. What none of the Soviet officers present that day in Tehran could have imagined was that their private admissions about American aid were being carefully recorded, not just by American stenographers, but by their own NKVD agents, creating a secret record that would contradict decades of Soviet propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. The truth about Soviet transportation began with disaster. On June 22, 1941, when 3.8 million Axis soldiers crashed across the Soviet frontier in Operation Barbarossa, they found a Red Army woefully unprepared for mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, numbering approximately 700,000 vehicles, consisted primarily of the Gaz AA, a licensed copy of the 1930 Ford Model AA, and the ZIS-5, based on 1920s American designs. Within 6 months, 40% of this fleet lay destroyed or captured. The numbers told a story of industrial inadequacy that Soviet propaganda would spend decades trying to hide. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced just 124,176 trucks and lost nearly 300,000. The Ghazi factory in Gorky, the nation's primary truck manufacturer, had to be evacuated eastward as German forces approached, cutting production to a trickle. The ZIS factory in Moscow converted to tank production as the Wehrmacht stood at the city's gates. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies moved on foot while their artillery was pulled by horses, when horses could be found. The Second Shock Army, trapped in the Fulkov Pocket, lost 95% of its transport attempting to break out. Soldiers carried shells on their backs for guns they could no longer move. This was the Red Army that American aid would transform, though it would take Soviet leaders 40 years to publicly acknowledge the transformation. The Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads had demonstrated what modern warfare required: mobility, speed, and reliable logistics. Soviet forces, despite their numerical superiority in many categories, found themselves outmaneuvered and encircled repeatedly because they couldn't match German mobility. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized marched on foot. Artillery batteries that needed prime movers relied on horses that died by the thousands in the Russian winter. October 1st, 1941. Arkhangelsk Port, Soviet Arctic. The British convoy PQ-1 discharged its cargo in the frozen darkness of the Arctic autumn. 20 American trucks, the very first of what would become a flood, rolled onto Soviet soil. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed cabs and reliable engines, seemed like miracles to Soviet drivers accustomed to vehicles that required hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. By November 1941, when the Wehrmacht stood 12 miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were already arriving at a rate of 2,000 per month through multiple routes. The Persian Corridor, managed by American engineers who had taken over the Iranian state railway, increased its capacity by 600%. The Pacific route, though limited to non-military supplies due to Soviet-Japanese neutrality, still moved thousands of vehicles. The dangerous Arctic convoys, despite heavy losses to U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks, continued to deliver precious cargo. The vehicles themselves represented a technological leap that Soviet mechanics could barely comprehend. The Studebaker US-6 featured six-wheel drive, all six wheels powered, compared to only four wheels on Soviet trucks, with just two powered. The engine produced 94 horsepower versus the ZIS-5's 73. Most critically, the American trucks came with self-recovery winches, allowing them to pull themselves from mud that would trap Soviet vehicles until spring. These trucks came fully equipped with tools that Soviet forces had never seen: complete 128-piece tool kits, hydraulic jacks, tyre repair equipment, spare parts catalogues with numbered components. A Soviet truck came with basic hand tools, if it came with tools at all. The Americans had thought of everything: cold weather starting equipment, cabin heaters that actually worked, sealed electrical systems that didn't short in wet conditions. The Tehran Conference of November 28 to December 1, 1943, produced one of the most extraordinary admissions in Soviet history, though it would remain classified in American archives until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November 30th, with only Roosevelt, Churchill and their closest advisers present, Stalin rose for a toast that directly contradicted everything Soviet propaganda would claim for the next half-century. According to Charles Bolan, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin declared, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out, at most, 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin had specifically emphasized trucks during the technical discussions that followed. The Soviet leader stated that the American Studebakers were the best trucks in the world for our conditions, and called them the foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet just 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly declare that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary and represented only about 10% of Soviet production. This lie would become Soviet orthodoxy, enforced by censors and historians who knew the truth but valued their careers and lives more than historical accuracy. The Tehran Conference records also revealed other crucial admissions. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov told American logistics officers, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us." This from a military leader who publicly credited only Soviet industry with victory. To understand why American trucks proved so decisive, one must grasp the arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single Soviet rifle division in attack required 450 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies. In defense, it needed 300 tons. A tank corps required 1,000 tons. Moving these supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's primitive road network required trucks. Major General Andrei Krylev, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report revealed the stark mathematics. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for offensive operations. Soviet production from January to September 1943 totaled just 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries in the same period, 94,000 vehicles. Without American vehicles, Soviet forces could not operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines. The qualitative difference mattered as much as quantity. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZIS-5 and Gaz-AA, had cargo capacities of 2.5 to 3 tons, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on front roads without breaking down. American Studebaker US-6s, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely carried 5 tons on good roads and 3 tons cross-country. Their mean time between failures was 10,000 kilometers compared to 2,000 for Soviet trucks. The mechanical superiority extended beyond reliability. American trucks featured innovations Soviet designers hadn't imagined: air brakes that worked in any weather, aluminum pistons that reduced engine weight, oil filters that actually filtered, thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperature. Soviet trucks had mechanical brakes that failed when wet, cast iron pistons, settling tanks that rarely worked, and engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. While Arctic convoys captured public imagination with their desperate battles against U-boats, the Persian Corridor quietly became the primary route for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border represented one of the greatest logistics achievements in military history. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure in months. They inherited a single-track railway, moving 200 tons daily, and increased capacity to 6,000 tons. They built highways where only camel paths existed. They constructed assembly plants in the desert that could process 300 trucks daily. The truck assembly plant at Andimeshk became the symbol of American industrial might, transplanted to the Middle East. Soviet drivers would arrive after grueling journeys from the Caucasus, receive 3 days of training on American vehicles, then drive their new trucks 1,800 miles back to the front. The cultural shock was profound. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to vehicles that required constant repair, suddenly commanded machines that simply worked. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was delivering thousands of trucks monthly. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled 50,000 tons annually before the war, was processing 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency stunned Soviet liaison officers who reported to Moscow about dock operations that unloaded ships in 48 hours, tasks that took Soviet ports 2 weeks. The total vehicles delivered through this route reached into the tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting nearly half of all American trucks reached the Soviet Union via Iran. The corridor operated with an efficiency that Soviet logistics officers studied and tried to replicate, though they lacked the industrial infrastructure to match American methods. The marriage of American trucks to Soviet rocket artillery created one of the most feared weapons of World War II. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on ZS-6 trucks, but production of this vehicle ceased in late 1941. The handful of rail-mounted and towed versions proved nearly useless in mobile warfare. The Studebaker US-6 changed everything. Its reinforced chassis could handle the violent recoil of a full rocket salvo. Its 6-wheel drive allowed it to fire and relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived. The cross-country performance of the Studebaker was so superior that it became the standardized mount in 1943, designated BM-13N, Normalizovany, standardized. More than 1,800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by war's end. Guards formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates 400% higher than those using Soviet vehicles. The ability to shoot and scoot, fire a salvo and relocate within 3 minutes depended entirely on reliable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they worked at all, needed 15 minutes for the same evolution. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. German soldiers called them Stalin's organs, but noted they rode on American trucks. The standardization on American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics. One manual, one set of parts, one type of training instead of the improvisation that characterized earlier efforts. The production mathematics. Analyzing production statistics reveals the mathematical impossibility of Soviet victory without American trucks. Soviet vehicle production during the war totaled approximately 1941, 46,100 vehicles from June 22nd. 1942, 32,300 vehicles. 1943, 41,600 vehicles. 1944, 57,400 vehicles. 1945, 27,600 vehicles through May. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units, less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this, losses were catastrophic, nearly 300,000 vehicles in 1941 alone, with continued losses throughout the war totaling over 500,000 vehicles. Without American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle park would have shrunk to nothing by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad depended on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles comprised 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet, but represented 70% of its actual transport capacity, due to their superior carrying capacity and reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US-6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them free through Lend-Lease. To produce equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union approximately $800 million $1943, resources desperately needed for tank and aircraft production, plus the industrial capacity the USSR simply didn't possess. Operation Bagration, launched June 23, 1944, demonstrated definitively that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which destroyed German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been impossible without American vehicles. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning showed the mathematical dependency. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Soviet railways could deliver to depots 60 to 100 kilometers behind the lines. From there, only trucks could maintain the advance. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of them American. The speed of advance, 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, overwhelmed German planning, which assumed Soviet forces would need operational pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild logistics. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive capability based on Soviet truck production, not knowing that American vehicles had tripled Red Army transport capacity. During Bagration's 5 weeks, American trucks in Soviet service carried 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself delivered largely by other American trucks. Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained the offensive for 1 week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark. The failed Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 had stalled partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within days. By 1944, with American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks, turning tactical victories into strategic triumph. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left 3 separate testimonies about American aid that remained hidden until the Soviet collapse. Each added details that demolished the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware of hidden microphones, Zhukov stated, "People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us materiel without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came in interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966, tape recordings that remained suppressed until 1990. Zhukov was explicit. Without American Studebakers, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport. The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript, seized in 1969 and locked in archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells in 2 weeks, possible only with American vehicles making continuous supply runs. Nikita Khrushchev's secretly recorded memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contained perhaps the most comprehensive admission about Soviet dependence on American aid. His testimony was authenticated through voice analysis and corroborated by other sources after the Soviet collapse. I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain, Khrushchev stated. He stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure, and we would have lost the war. Khrushchev specifically addressed trucks. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me. Our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. This same Khrushchev, as Soviet Premier, would publicly declare that the Soviet Union accomplished victory with its own resources, a contradiction that epitomized Soviet schizophrenia about American aid. Soviet mechanics who maintained American trucks understood the technological gap between American and Soviet automotive engineering. American engines used aluminum pistons. Soviet engines used heavy cast iron. American trucks had oil filters. Soviet trucks relied on settling tanks. American vehicles featured sealed wheel bearings lasting 50,000 kilometers. Soviet bearings lasted 5,000 if lucky. The spare parts system amazed Soviet mechanics. Americans sent catalogues showing every part with numbers. Order by number, exact part arrives. Soviet system: cannibalize broken vehicles or manufacture parts by hand. American trucks included safety equipment. Soviet designers never considered safety glass, mirrors on both sides, backup lights, horns operable with one hand. Beyond immediate military impact, American trucks revolutionized Soviet automotive thinking. Soviet engineers studying American vehicles learned lessons that influenced post-war Soviet truck design for decades. The ZIS-150, the Soviet Union's first post-war mass-produced truck, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of American design principles learned from Studebakers. American trucks introduced maintenance culture previously unknown in Soviet practice. Preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, parts standardization. These concepts came directly from studying American vehicles and would influence Soviet industrial development for a generation. The Soviet failure in the 1939–40 Winter War against Finland had exposed catastrophic logistics weakness. Unable to supply troops just 150 kilometers from Leningrad, the Red Army suffered 126,875 dead and 264,908 wounded against Finnish forces 1/10 their size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis identified truck shortage as critical. Soviet forces had numerical superiority, but couldn't concentrate due to transport limitations. By 1944, American trucks had solved the problems exposed in Finland. The Soviet offensive against Finnish forces in June 1944 succeeded precisely because American vehicles maintained supply lines through terrain that had defeated Soviet logistics 4 years earlier. Soviet propaganda often claimed railways, not trucks, were key to logistics, minimizing American vehicle importance. Declassified General Staff studies reveal why this was impossible. Germans destroyed 65,000 kilometres of track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations during retreat. Soviet railway troops could restore about 20 kilometres daily under combat conditions, but restored single-track lines handled only 6 to 8 trains daily versus 40 to 50 on intact double-track routes. More critically, railways ended at fixed points. The final 50 to 100 kilometres to combat units required trucks. No trucks meant no supplies at the front. The Germans learned this lesson fatally. Their excellent railway engineers kept pace initially, but lack of trucks meant supplies accumulated uselessly at railheads, while combat units starved for ammunition. While Studebakers captured Soviet imagination, the full range of American vehicles proved equally important. The 51,503 Willys Jeeps revolutionized reconnaissance and command functions. The 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided tactical mobility for infantry squads, while 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as divisional workhorses. Marshal Ivan Konev noted that Jeeps allowed real-time battle control, with commanders visiting multiple divisions daily, accelerating the command cycle and providing decisive advantage. The systematic suppression of Lend-Lease acknowledgement began even before the war ended. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order Number 7572. All photographs of foreign equipment to be censored from publication. Soviet industry alone must be credited with victory. This initiated a 40-year campaign to erase American trucks from Soviet war memory. Photo sensors painted over American vehicles, replacing them with Soviet equipment. Films showing American trucks were edited or destroyed. Veterans' memoirs were censored to remove foreign aid references. The suppression extended to statistics. The official 1960 Soviet history claimed Lend-Lease represented only 4% of Soviet wartime production, achieved through accounting manipulation that compared American deliveries to total Soviet production, including civilian goods, using ruble values that undervalued American equipment. When veterans submitted memoirs describing American vehicles, editors systematically replaced specific references with vague terms. Studebaker became truck. American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages were rewritten to eliminate any hint of foreign aid. As Cold War tensions escalated, the suppression intensified. By 1948, Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky issued reports claiming Lend-Lease represented merely 4% of Soviet production, while denouncing America as leader of the anti-democratic camp. This became the official line for 4 decades. Soviet historians who knew the truth faced an impossible choice: repeat lies or risk their careers. Most chose safety, producing histories that credited Soviet industry alone with victory. The distortion affected education. Soviet schoolchildren learned that their nation defeated Hitler essentially alone. Museums displayed captured German equipment but hid American vehicles. War memorials celebrated Soviet tanks but never mentioned the trucks that carried ammunition to the front. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost finally permitted honest discussion. In 1989, Military History Journal published Tehran conference transcripts showing Stalin's admission. The reaction was explosive. Readers discovered their entire understanding of the war was built on lies. Veterans finally spoke truthfully. At a 1990 Moscow reunion, former drivers stood and testified about their American trucks, revealing stories hidden for 45 years. Archival revelations were stunning. Researchers discovered dual bookkeeping, real statistics for internal planning, false ones for public consumption. The real numbers showed American trucks comprised 70% of Soviet transport capacity by 1945. Dr. Boris Sokolov, examining newly opened archives, calculated definitively: remove American trucks from Soviet military and every offensive after Stalingrad fails. The Red Army marched to Berlin on American boots and rode on American trucks. The Battle of Berlin in April–May 1945 provided the ultimate demonstration of American trucks' importance. The logistics requirements were staggering. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 41,600 artillery pieces, all requiring continuous supply across destroyed German territory. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone required 25,000 tons of supplies daily. His logistics network included 22,000 trucks, 16,000 American. The ammunition expenditure, 2.5 million artillery shells in the first week, required trucks making continuous runs under fire. Each American truck averaged 4 supply runs daily, 100 kilometers round trip. Soviet trucks, when operational, managed 1 run before breakdown. Even in victory's moment, dependency remained. The victory parade through Berlin was accomplished with American vehicles, most presentable, most reliable. Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital riding Roosevelt's trucks. The complete accounting of American aid, finally revealed after the Soviet collapse, was staggering. Vehicles delivered 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,303 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, 2,328 ordnance service vehicles, supporting materials, 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives, 11,075 railroad cars. The vehicle deliveries alone represented more trucks than Germany produced during the entire war, enough transport to completely motorize 60 rifle divisions. By war's end, American vehicles had transported 60% of all ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of wounded, and towed 58% of artillery pieces. In the immediate post-war period, grateful Soviet officials proposed monuments to American aid. Marshal Zhukov suggested a memorial to the Allied arsenal of democracy. The Communist Party rejected all proposals. For 45 years, no monument acknowledged American trucks' role. Only in 2004 was a modest Lend-Lease memorial unveiled in Murmansk. Even then, controversy erupted. The absence of monuments reflected deeper tragedy, theft of historical memory. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation defeated Hitler alone. As the last veterans pass away, their testimonies become precious historical documents. At a 2005 gathering in Moscow, the remaining drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood to preserve true history. They collected photographs hidden for 60 years, showing American vehicles with Soviet markings. Their final statement, signed by 200 veterans, declared, "We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. This is not diminishment of Soviet sacrifice. 27 million of our people died. But truth honors their memory better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland." Today, as Russia again revises World War II history for political purposes, the Lend-Lease story carries renewed relevance. Modern Russian textbooks minimize American aid even more than Soviet ones, part of a broader campaign to restore national pride through historical mythology. Yet the mathematical facts remain unchanged. The documented delivery of 427,284 American vehicles, more than double Soviet wartime production of 205,000 trucks, cannot be erased. The testimony of Stalin, Khrushchev and Zhukov, preserved in multiple archives, cannot be denied. The truth serves as a reminder that international cooperation, not isolation, defeated fascism. The American trucks that carried Soviet soldiers to victory were products of democracy's arsenal, shared freely with an ally despite ideological differences. The story of American trucks in Soviet service transcends military logistics. It demonstrates how industrial capacity wins modern wars, how ideology distorts history, and how truth eventually emerges despite suppression. The 427,284 American trucks and jeeps that reached the Soviet Union represented the margin between victory and defeat on the Eastern Front. They transformed the Red Army from a World War I-style force dependent on railways and horses into a mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across continental distances. Soviet leaders knew this truth. Stalin admitted at Tehran that without American machines, we would have lost the war. Zhukov confessed that without American trucks, Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Khrushchev acknowledged that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure. Yet, for 45 years, the Soviet Union maintained a false narrative. Photos were doctored, memoirs censored, statistics falsified. The Communist Party stole from its people the true history of their victory, replacing it with mythology that served political purposes but dishonoured historical truth. Only with glasnost did the full truth emerge from archives, recordings, and testimonies. The evidence proved overwhelmingly that American trucks didn't just assist the Soviet war effort, they enabled it. The Studebakers that Soviet soldiers called Zakodnik, go anywhere, were as essential to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial. The suppression and eventual revelation of this truth carries lessons beyond military history. It demonstrates how authoritarian regimes manipulate memory, how political necessities override accuracy, and how truth ultimately emerges despite official suppression. Today, the mathematical fact remains. Soviet forces rode to victory in Berlin on American trucks. The arsenal of democracy defeated the Wehrmacht not just with weapons, but with wheels, 427,284 of them, crossing oceans and continents to carry the Red Army to victory. The American trucks that transformed the Red Army represent more than machines. They symbolize how industrial democracy's productive capacity, shared freely even with ideological opponents, proved decisive in humanity's struggle against fascism. The Soviet generals who admitted they would have lost without American trucks spoke a truth that transcends politics. Modern wars are won not by courage alone, but by the marriage of bravery and industrial might. In the end, the sturdy Studebakers that survived decades in Soviet service outlasted the lies told about them. The veterans knew, the documents proved, and history records. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory. The wheels of the arsenal of democracy carried not just supplies, but the hopes of nations to triumph over tyranny. The final irony is that American generosity created the very Soviet power that would spend 45 years denying American contribution. Yet truth, like those reliable American engines, endures beyond political manipulation. Soviet generals were right. They would have lost without 400,000 American trucks,